Night falls slowly over a small village in Eastern Europe, not as a sudden darkness, but as something that seeps in, slipping into the corners of houses, the trunks of trees, the narrow paths that lead out toward the fields. A thin mist hangs close to the ground, dulling the moonlight, as if the sky itself does not want to see what is about to unfold. There are no church bells, no prayers carried on the air, and no sound of weeping. Instead, there is only the dull, heavy rhythm of metal striking earth. A shovel sinks into the soil, lifts, then sinks again. The movement is slow, deliberate, almost cautious, as though the man holding it is afraid of waking something that sleeps beneath the ground. Every motion is measured. No one rushes. No one speaks. The men stand in a loose circle, shoulders nearly touching their faces, flickering in the unsteady glow of torches. Their eyes avoid one another. No one wants to meet another gaze for too long. This is not a funeral. The dead have already been buried. There was a priest. There was soil thrown over the grave. There were final words spoken. Everything should have ended there. But tonight, they have come back. They are not here to say goodbye. They are here to face something. In villages like this, death is not a stranger. People are born, live, and die on the same land their ancestors worked for centuries. The cemetery does not exist at the edge of memory. It stands beside everyday life. Children run past the graves on their way home. Adults pass the cemetery each morning on their way to the fields. The living and the dead have never been far apart, and because of that, fear has never been far either. The dead in their belief do not always stay still. Not every soul leaves when it should. Some deaths are incomplete. Some spirits refuse to abandon the house, the land the family they once belonged to. Some things, even after being buried, are believed to continue breathing in the dark. They call it Strigoi, not a monster from a distant castle, not an aristocratic creature draped in black with polished fangs and romantic shadows. Strigoi does not come from novels or faraway legends. It comes from this village, from the neighbor who once laughed beside you, from the father who died only weeks ago, from the wife who once slept at your side. Strigoi is the most intimate fear a person can imagine. The fear that those we loved will return, and that when they do, they will no longer be who they were. The shovel stops in midair. The moment stretches longer than it should. The man holding it does not know why his hands have frozen. Perhaps he is tired. Perhaps he is cold. Or perhaps a thought has crossed his mind, one no one dares to speak aloud. What if what lies beneath is not what they think it is? No one urges him on. No one gives an order. And yet the shovel comes down again. Earth is thrown aside, layer by layer, with every shovelful. Another barrier is stripped away, not only between the living and the dead, but between what should never be done and what now feels unavoidable. In their world, disturbing a grave is a taboo, a sin, an offense against God and the departed. But in that same world, allowing a Strigoi to walk freely out of the earth is a greater sin still. This is the paradox they live with. Between two fears, they must choose the one that feels less unbearable. The air grows thick. Each strike of the shovel feels heavier than the last, not because the soil is hardened, but because those digging begin to sense how close they are to a point of no return. The men standing around the pit clutch their coats, then their chests. No one stares down into the hole for too long. They are afraid of the moment the shovel strikes wood, because when that happens, the question will no longer be whether they should continue, but what they will do with the truth lying in front of them. In this world, Strigoi is not an abstract idea. It is an explanation for what cannot otherwise be explained. When a healthy family withers one by one, when children wake with bruises that have no cause, when livestock die, milk dries up, and harvests fail, when sickness spreads faster than prayer. In a world without germs, without science, without any understanding of contagion, Strigoi becomes the only answer that restores order. It provides a cause, a culprit, and most importantly, something that can be destroyed. But at what cost? The people standing around the pit tonight are not blind zealots. They are farmers, fathers, mothers, people who buried their loved ones with their own hands. They understand that if they are wrong, they are committing a crime, but they also know that if they are right and do nothing, the entire village will pay the price. That is why no one cries. Tears are for deaths that have been accepted. This is a death that has not yet ended. Strigoi, then, is more than a creature of folklore. It is the shape of a deeper, more haunting question, one that still echoes even now. What is more terrifying, the dead returning in the night, or the living being forced to believe that they have? When the shovel finally strikes the coffin lid, the dry, hollow sound cuts through the silence like a declaration that cannot be undone. No one speaks, no one prays. In that moment, they all understand that they have crossed the thinnest boundary. A human being can cross the boundary between fear and action, between belief and desperation, between the dead and those who refuse to stay buried. And this is only the beginning. Before crosses hung on wooden walls, before church bells called the living and sent off the dead, before people believed the soul would rise to heaven or fall into hell, this land already carried its own memory. The Carpathian Mountains did not stand as mere stone and earth. They had witnessed too many generations arrive and disappear, too many deaths buried that never truly vanished. The forest was not a space between villages, but the center of the world itself, a living presence older than any bloodline, breathing with the land, remembering every footstep that had ever passed through it. The ancient people did not enter the forest with a sense of conquest. They stepped into it cautiously, heads lowered, as if entering a temple without walls. The forest saw them. The mountains heard them. And the creatures that lived there were not simply animals, but embodiments of forces no human being could ever control. The wolf in that world was more than a predator. It was the spirit of the night, a being that moved along the boundary between instinct and will. When wolves howled deep in the forest, people did not hear only a call to the pack. They heard a reminder that humans had never stood at the center of the universe. In such a world, death was not a door that closed. It was only a shift. The dead did not go anywhere. They remained here, in the forests where they once hunted. On the paths they walked each day, in the houses where their final breath still lingered in the wooden beams. The soul, according to ancient belief, did not leave the world simply because the body had stopped moving. It lingered, it watched, it waited. The boundary between the living and the dead was therefore not a wall. It was like a thin veil of mist, something you could see through during the day but never fully trust at night. The old people lived with that awareness every day. They did not confront death because death had never left them to be confronted. It sat beside the hearth, listened to stories, and slipped quietly into sleep itself. When someone fell, the community did not believe the soul had vanished. They believed it had changed the way it existed. And not every soul was gentle. Some deaths carried resentment. Some came too early, while desire, anger, and regret had not yet settled. Those souls, according to ancient belief, were heavier. They did not rise. They clung to the earth, to roots, to the foundations of houses, to the very people they had once loved. The forest became a refuge for those who refused to leave. Not all forests were the same. There were forests people crossed only during daylight, and forests no one dared enter even when the sun stood high. The elders said the forest remembered everything. It remembered who had died unjustly, who had died in rage, who had died without speaking their final words. The forest kept it all. In this world, people did not live in opposition to death. They lived with it. They ate beside it, slept beside it, and taught their children how not to anger things that no longer breathed but still listened. A child did not grow up learning that death was an end. The child was taught that death was another state, and that if one was careless, that state could turn around and look back. Before Christianity arrived, before the ideas of salvation or final judgment, the greatest fear was not punishment after death, but the failure to die completely. A bad death was not one of pain, but one left unfinished, and an unfinished soul was a dangerous soul. It was within this worldview that the seed of Strigoi existed long before it had a name. It had no clear shape, yet only the uneasy sense that some of the dead did not leave, and that their presence bent the world out of alignment. Plants withered for no clear reason. Livestock collapsed without wounds. People woke with the feeling of being watched, as if invisible eyes had never left them through the long night. No one called it Strigoi, but everyone knew something was staying behind. When the sun sank behind the mountains, darkness not only covered the land, it settled into thought itself. Night was not a time of rest. It was when boundaries weakened, when wandering souls were most likely to lose their way, and when humans were most likely to hear sounds they pretended did not exist during the day. A branch snapping in the forest, a rustle behind the house, a dream too vivid to forget. Any of it could be a sign. In a world without heaven or hell, people did not hope to die to reach a better place. They hoped to die so as not to become something else, something that lingered too long, something that refused to dissolve into the soil. That fear shaped how they lived, how they buried their dead, how they watched the dying, and how they whispered about those who had passed once night fell. Because before people believed the soul would be judged in another world, they believed something far more terrifying, that the soul could remain right here, close at hand, and not always bring peace with it. This was the dark, damp ground where Strigoi would slowly take shape, and from there, fear would no longer remain vague. When the ancient Greeks first wrote about the tribes living in the mountains north of the Balkans, what unsettled them was not the wildness of the land, but the way its people looked directly at death without lowering their eyes. Herodotus, in his accounts, called them brave and just. Yet beneath that respect lay an unease he could not fully conceal, because these people did not believe that humans truly died. They believed that existence merely changed its form. That belief centered on a single name, Zalmoxis. To them, Zalmoxis was at once a god, a teacher, and the final destination of the soul. Zalmoxis taught that death was not an ending, but a journey. When the body ceased to breathe, the soul left it behind and traveled to the god, continuing to exist in another state. At first glance, it was a comforting belief, but after living with it long enough, the darker side of immortality began to reveal itself. If humans did not truly die, then death was no longer a door that closed forever. And if that door did not exist, the boundary between staying and leaving became uncertain. The soul was no longer guaranteed to disappear from the world of the living. Herodotus recorded that the Getae did not weep when someone died. They celebrated believing the deceased had gone to Zalmoxis. Yet this belief did not make them gentle with death. It made them believe death could be used, controlled, even forced. Every few years, the community performed a ritual that chilled outsiders to the bone. A person was chosen, often a volunteer. That person was entrusted with the wishes and pleas of the entire community. Then before the eyes of all, they were thrown onto upright spear points. If the person died instantly, the message had been delivered and Zalmoxis had accepted it. If the person survived, there was no mercy. They were deemed unworthy, and another would be chosen in their place. Here, death was not fate. It was a tool, a means of communication with the divine, a door that could be forced open through violence. This way of thinking warped the meaning of departure itself. When death could be triggered at will, it lost its absolute sacredness. And when the soul was believed to persist after death, a dangerous question began to form, even if no one dared speak it aloud. If a soul could be pushed away, what happened when it did not go far enough? Zalmoxis promised immortality, but not rest. In this belief, the soul required the correct ritual to leave the world. It needed the proper moment. It needed the consent of the community. And if the ritual failed, if the soul did not take the right path, it did not vanish. It became trapped. That idea quietly took root in the human mind. Some deaths were created, but never completed. Souls pushed out of their bodies without being guided to a final place. They were no longer living, but they did not belong to the realm of the gods either. They existed in between. In that suspended state, immortality was no longer a reward. It became a burden, because a soul that did not dissolve clung to what it knew, to the land, to the old house, to the people who were still breathing. This became the foundation of a deeply unsettling way of thinking, the belief that death was not always enough, and that when death failed, the community had to intervene to complete it. No one spoke of killing a person twice, but the logic was already there. If ritual could send a soul away, ritual could also be used to prevent it from returning. Death ceased to be a single moment belonging to an individual and became a process overseen by the community. Later, when Christianity arrived, with clearer ideas of heaven-hell and final judgment, belief in Zalmoxis slowly receded, but the structure of that thinking did not disappear. It only changed form. Instead of sending souls to an ancient god, people spoke of salvation, exorcism, and release. Beneath the surface of new prayers, an old logic remained quietly intact. The belief that a soul does not leave on its own, that it must be guided, and that if guided incorrectly, it would wander between worlds. Strigoi does not yet appear here with a defined shape, but its seed has already been planted deep. In the belief that humans do not die completely, communities had grown accustomed to the idea that they had the right to intervene in a person's fate, even after death. When generations later, people dug up graves, drove stakes, severed heads, and burned hearts, they did not believe they were inventing something new. In the collective unconscious, they were continuing a very ancient tradition. The tradition that some deaths were unfinished and some souls needed to be dealt with again so the world could return to balance. Zalmoxis taught them that humans do not truly die, but he did not teach them what to do with souls that refused to leave. That absence became fertile ground for fear. And when fear met disease, famine, and chains of death, it demanded a concrete shape to cling to name, to destroy. Later, that shape would become clear. Later, people would call it Strigoi. But long before that name was spoken, they already believed something colder than any curse, that death could be forced, and that sometimes, because of that, it had to be done again. When the first wooden cross was raised on this land, it did not replace the old beliefs. It stood beside them. Christianity did not arrive like a storm that swept the past away. It came slowly, step by step, slipping into the lives of communities long accustomed to living with forests, with spirits, with things unseen. Wooden churches rose at the edges of villages, but the forest remained. Church bells began to ring each morning, but when night fell, the howls of wolves still echoed from the distance, just as they always had. People learned to make the sign of the cross, but they did not forget how to whisper to the darkness. Christianity brought a promise clearer than any belief before it: heaven for the righteous, hell for the sinful, a final judgment where every soul would be placed where it belonged. In theory, this should have erased the ancient fear that souls might wander between worlds. But fear does not disappear simply because people are told it should not exist. The people who lived here were already too familiar with death that refused to follow order. They had seen children die before their parents. They had seen strong men collapse within days. They had watched illness move from house to house like a curse with no face. In those moments, the promise of heaven in a distant world was not strong enough to silence a fear that lived close to home. And so two belief systems began to exist side by side, neither merging nor erasing the other. By day, people prayed before the altar. By night, they listened to the sounds coming from the forest. They believed in God, but they also believed that there were things that did not obey him. In this process, the wandering spirits of the old world began to acquire new names. They were no longer restless ancestors or nameless shadows in the woods. They became demons, entities that had rejected the order of God. This transformation mattered. A lost soul could be pitied. A demon had to be destroyed. It is here that Strigoi began to take clearer shape. It was no longer just a vague sense that the dead had not left. It became something with intent, with will, with malice, not because it was born that way, but because the new world required a new explanation for an old fear. From the pulpit, priests spoke of salvation. Outside the church doors, people whispered about unclean deaths. Those who died without confession, children who died unbaptized, those who died carrying hatred, envy, or despair. Such deaths, under the new logic, were not merely unfinished, they were dangerous. Their souls were not simply lost, they were tainted, and a tainted soul, if not held in check, could return. What made this terrifying was the absence of a clear boundary. Christianity offered no precise list of who would become a Strigoi. It spoke only of sin, and sin in the harsh realities of rural life was something anyone could carry. Fear then did not point outward. It turned inward into the community and deeper still into the family. People began to look at the dying with different eyes, not only with compassion, but with anxiety. They listened to final words, not just to remember them, but to search for signs. Was there resentment? A curse? Something left unsaid. Death itself became a dangerous moment. There were more prayers, but also more watching. Crosses were placed beside beds, but every final movement was observed, not from lack of faith, but because faith did not answer every question. This uneasy coexistence created a deeply unstable inner world. People believed God was all-powerful, yet also believed there were things he did not intervene in quickly enough. They trusted in salvation while preparing themselves for the worst. Strigoi grew in that space. It did not emerge as a rebellion against Christianity. It slipped into the cracks, into places where doctrine could not reach emotion. When a family lost one member and then watched the others grow sick, prayer alone could not explain the pattern. Strigoi could. When livestock died without cause, when crops failed despite blessings, Strigoi became an easier answer than admitting the world was chaotic and unjust. And because Strigoi was seen as a force, opposed to divine order, resisting it was no longer superstition. It became a necessary act to protect the community. This prevented open conflict. There was no war between church and village. Instead, there was a quiet compromise. Priests condemned grave desecration from the pulpit, but when night fell, they did not ask too many questions about what had happened in the cemetery. Prayer and fear coexisted. Hymns filled the daylight hours. Whispers of Strigoi filled the night. Within this atmosphere, Strigoi slowly became more defined in the collective imagination. It was no longer just a soul. It was tied to a body, to a grave, to physical signs, something that could be found, identified, and dealt with. This was the most dangerous shift of all, because when fear takes shape, people will try to touch it. And when they believe they have the authority of faith to do so, moral boundaries become dangerously thin. Christianity did not erase the ancient fear. It gave it a new language, a new system of symbols, and a new sense of legitimacy. Strigoi was no longer a vague remnant of a pre-Christian world. It became a concrete threat in a world that now had God's sin and a defined concept of evil. And once people believed that evil could rise from their own dead, the question was no longer whether Strigoi existed. It became how far they were willing to go to stop it. The answer would not come all at once. It would take shape slowly through each death, each whisper and each ritual carried out in the dark, where prayer and fear could no longer be cleanly separated. After death had been wrapped in ritual and sin, fear did not stop with the dead. It began to slide backward toward life itself, toward the very first moment a human enters the world, toward the instant a child cries out before its eyes have even opened and is already met with careful measuring glances. In the villages of the Carpathians, birth was never a clean beginning. It was a sign, a suggestion, a question without an answer. People believed destiny did not wait for a person to grow before revealing itself. It was already there, present at the moment of arrival. Some children were born with a thin membrane covering their heads, which modern medicine would later call the amniotic sac. In folklore, this was not biology. It was a mark, a fragment of a burial shroud from another world, a piece of death that had touched life too early. When such a child was born, the room did not hold only the sound of crying. It held silence. The midwife's movements slowed. The women gathered nearby, exchanged wordless glances. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that from that moment on the child was different. No one hated the child. No one cursed it. But no one was ever fully at ease. They pitied the child because it was innocent, yet they feared it because they believed it carried something that did not belong to this world. A step placed wrong between two realms. A misalignment no one dared correct. It was said that if the membrane was not handled properly, if the child accidentally swallowed part of it, then fate had already been sealed, not in life, but later when death came, and the soul would refuse to leave, as others did. These children grew up between two emotions that existed side by side. They were loved, but never forgotten. Every illness, every restless sleep, every unusual behavior was remembered not to accuse, but to guard against. Perhaps the most terrifying thing was not being hated, but being watched for an entire lifetime. And it was not only children born with the membrane who carried a mark. In a world where numbers had spirit's birth order, itself carried the weight of fate. People believed that the seventh son, born in an unbroken line of 7 sons, was something rare and dangerous. A person with 2 souls, one human and another unnamed, indistinct, hovering just beyond explanation. That child might grow up ordinary, might become a healer, a wise man, or someone said to possess a second sight. But that variability was also a warning. A soul too close to the unseen would struggle to leave this world when death came. No one said outright that such children would become Strigoi, but fear does not need to be spoken plainly. It lives in quiet cautions, in lingering looks, in whispered conversations when the child passes by. If you lived in a village like this, you would understand that fear does not require monsters. It only needs memory. Marked children did not live in darkness. They lived among the community. Yet an invisible distance always remained, not wide enough to separate them, but wide enough to remind everyone that they were not entirely like the others. Adults told themselves it was only a precaution, only care, but that very caution planted a possibility deep in the collective mind, the possibility that disaster would not come from outside, but would grow within the village, inside a familiar house wearing the face of a child, once held in loving arms. This created a particular kind of Gothic terror. There were no ghosts, no sounds in the night, only the feeling that fate had already been written and that the community was waiting to see whether it would come true. As the child grew, every action was read through a different lens. Anger was no longer just a temper. Silence was no longer just a personality. Everything could become a sign. And the most dangerous thing was that the child began to sense it too. No one ever told them they were suspected, but humans are acutely aware when they are seen differently through slight hesitation. Silences that last too long, reminders always wrapped in concern. Over time, fear did not remain in the community alone. It seeped into those who were marked. They grew up believing they had to control themselves, more than others live more carefully, and eventually die correctly. Because in this world, death was not merely the end of a life. It was the final test. And for those marked from birth, that test was doubted before it even began. Perhaps this is the moment when one should ask, even if never aloud, what truly creates a Strigoi, first a soul that refuses to leave, or a community that never allows someone to be entirely innocent. Marked children never chose their fate, but the way they were seen began to shape a path not toward becoming monsters, but toward fear, isolation, and a death forever questioned. At this stage, Strigoi does not even need to appear. The mere possibility of its existence is enough, because when people believe a child could become something after death, they have already prepared themselves to face it, and sometimes that preparation alone is enough to turn fear into reality. In these villages, not everyone becomes a Strigoi, but almost everyone grows up believing they could, and that belief itself is a shadow cast over life from the very first moment. Death in this world does not wait for people to grow old. It is already there, bending over the cradle, watching in silence. After fear has taken root, from the moment a person is born, it does not wait for death to reveal itself. In these villages, Strigoi is not only something that rises from the grave, it can still be alive, still breathing, still walking among people, wearing a completely human face, yet already believed to be different. They call this the living Strigoi, not a monster, not a corpse, but a person believed to carry a misaligned soul, an invisible imbalance that draws the life force out of the world around them without ever lifting a hand, without biting, without appearing in the night. Simply existing is enough. The signs are familiar. A cow suddenly gives no milk. A field withers even though the rains arrive on time. A healthy child wastes away over the course of a few weeks. There are no wounds, no explanation. And when there is no explanation, the community begins to search for a face to attach to its fear. A living Strigoi is never named at first. It begins with half-joking remarks, a glance held just a moment too long, a whisper when the person turns away. Gradually, coincidences begin to stack on top of one another. That person passed through the field before the harvest failed. That person visited a home before livestock began to die. That person lives beside a family now falling ill. The community does not say the person is evil. They say the person is different. Difference does not require proof. It only requires repetition. And in harsh rural life, where disaster and sickness are always close at hand, repetition of misfortune is never hard to find. The living Strigoi becomes the perfect explanation. No need to understand a complex world. Only the belief that someone is draining it dry. Here, fear does not point toward distant forces. It needs a specific human being, someone who can be pointed at, watched, and blamed. In years of failed harvests, the most dangerous thing is not barren soil, but the gaze of a neighbor. Those suspected of being living Strigoi are rarely attacked openly. They are not driven out all at once. Instead, they are isolated slowly. Fewer visits, fewer greetings. Children are warned to keep their distance. Livestock led along different paths. Each gesture is small, but together they form a closed circle. And the most terrifying part is that the suspected person often does not know exactly when they became something else in the eyes of the community. They only feel the change, the coldness, the caution, the sense that they carry something wrong without being able to name it. Perhaps that feeling itself feeds another layer of fear, because in this world, fear does not require evidence. It requires quiet agreement. The living Strigoi is believed to drain vitality silently, not through violence, but through presence. As if the soul does not fully seal itself, allowing what belongs to life around it to slip into an inner emptiness. Milk dries up, plants wither, people grow tired without knowing why. From a distance, this looks like a familiar mechanism of blame. But from within it, the question is no longer simple. When everything around you is collapsing, what do you choose? Do you accept that the world is chaotic and unjust? Or do you believe there is a specific cause, a specific person, that if controlled will restore order? Most people choose the second. The living Strigoi thus becomes a vessel for collective fear, not because they create disaster, but because the community needs somewhere to place disaster. When evil has a human shape, it is easier to endure than meaninglessness. It is no accident that the living Strigoi is often someone at the margins of society, the quiet one, the solitary one, the one with a different past, the one marked from birth. Small fragments of suspicion assemble into a complete picture. And once that picture has been drawn in the collective mind, truth has very little room left to exist. What makes this truly dangerous is that the living Strigoi does not exist only in the eyes of others. Over time, it can begin to exist in the mind of the accused. When an entire village looks at you as the source of misfortune, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether they are right. The boundary between accusation and self-doubt grows thin. Here, Strigoi does not need to die to cause harm. Living under the weight of the community's gaze is enough, but this belief does not stop in daylight. It does not end with whispers or glances, because if a person can drain life while awake, what happens when they sleep, when awareness loosens, when the soul is no longer tightly anchored to the body? This is where fear begins to slide into the darkness of night. People believe that on certain nights, when the boundary is thinnest, the soul of a living Strigoi can leave the body not to die, but to wander to meet others like itself, to continue invisible battles that decide the fate of villages' harvests and survival itself. By day, the living Strigoi still wears a human face, but when night falls, a question emerges in the silence. Does the body lying there still hold what belongs inside it, or has the soul stepped out, leaving an empty shell waiting for dawn? Once people believe the soul can leave the body during sleep, sleep is no longer rest. It becomes the most fragile moment of existence. And from here, Strigoi is no longer confined to daylight glances. It enters the night, where fear requires no proof, only darkness in which to grow. By day, fear can still be kept in check by light. People see one another, call each other by name, touch shoulders and hands to be sure that everyone is still here. But when night falls, the things that hold the world in place begin to loosen. Light retreats, sounds grow uncertain, and sleep, the thing meant to bring rest, becomes the most fragile moment of human existence. In the belief of the villagers, it is not death alone that causes the soul to leave the body. Sometimes sleeping deeply is enough. The living Strigoi, in this view, is not fully imprisoned within a human form. By day, the soul is anchored by consciousness, by the eyes of the community, by physical presence. But at night, as breathing steadies and the body relaxes, that anchor weakens. And when it weakens, the soul can slip free light, as mist leaving no trace behind. The terror does not lie in the soul leaving the body. It lies in the fact that the body remains alive. It lies there warm, breathing evenly, like an empty vessel, a temporary shell. And if something returns before dawn, no one dares to be certain that it is the same thing that left. People believe that on certain nights when the boundary between worlds is thinnest, the souls of the living Strigoi wander, not alone. They seek one another out, gathering in places that belong to no one. Crossroads, the edges of villages, clearings between trees, spaces humans avoid after dark. There those souls fight, not in the way humans understand war. There are no screams, no blood, only invisible collisions, forces that the living cannot see but are certain exist. Their weapons are not swords or spears, but familiar objects from daily life: the spindle from a loom, the sickle used to harvest grain, a dry branch snapped from the edge of a field. According to folk belief, these battles are not merely clashes between souls. They are struggling over fate itself. Their outcomes decide whether crops will flower or fail, whether livestock will survive the winter, and whether children will endure their first fever. From the outside, this sounds like superstition, but imagine living in a community entirely dependent on weather, soil, and forces beyond understanding. When every disaster arrives from outside human control, believing it is decided in unseen battles offers at least a sense of order. Someone is fighting for the village or against it, and if the result is ruin, then it is no longer random. It is because the other side has won. The Strigoi of day and the Strigoi of night are not separate beings. They are the same fear-shifting shape. By day, fear wears a human face, restrained by society. By night, it becomes purer, no longer needing explanation or disguise. Sleep, therefore, is no longer a refuge. It is a doorway, and that doorway is not always closed. People begin to watch one another sleep. Who sleeps too deeply? Who dreams too vividly? Who wakes with empty eyes? Small scratches appear without explanation. Weariness lingers without cause. Every sign can be read as evidence that something has happened during the night. Here no one truly sleeps alone. In the collective belief, every act of sleep carries consequences. A soul that leaves the body does not take only itself, but the fortune or misfortune of the entire village with it. And this leads to a question no one dares speak, yet everyone considers. If a soul can leave during sleep, how can anyone know it has returned correctly? There is no certain answer. That uncertainty stretches the night longer. Those who wake in the dark do not dare move. They listen to the breathing of the person beside them, partly for comfort, partly to be sure that person is still there in the truest sense of the word. Wind slips through door cracks. Floorboards creak softly. Any sound could be the sign of a soul returning, or one that never left at all. In this world, there is no clear way to distinguish between dreams and the wandering of the soul. And when that boundary dissolves, fear needs no further proof. It requires only darkness and an imagination long carefully fed. At this stage, Strigoi is no longer confined to a body or a grave. It becomes a phenomenon, an invisible force, entering every home each night, a reminder that life is never entirely safe even when the eyes are closed. Perhaps what terrifies people most is not the soul leaving the body, but the thought that when it returns, no one can be certain it is the same as before. And when a community believes its fate is decided in battles it cannot see, night ceases to be the quiet space between 2 days. It becomes a battlefield. From here on, fear will no longer remain only in whispers or daylight glances. It will demand concrete defenses, rituals, protective objects, actions, repeated until they become habit, because without them, people cannot sleep. And when sleep is no longer a refuge, the entire village enters a different state, one where fear must be controlled through action, whether that action truly works or not. This is the moment when Strigoi no longer exists, only in the darkness of night, but begins to shape how people live when the sun rises. When fear is no longer confined to the night, people cannot simply wait. Waiting allows imagination to grow unchecked. And in this world, imagination is the most dangerous thing of all. Fear must be bound to something tangible, to repeated actions, to objects that can be touched, to rituals, not to defeat the darkness, but to keep from collapsing beneath it. Garlic comes first, not because of its smell, but because of its presence. Bulbs are tied into braids and hung on doors, windows, and livestock pens. They appear in the most visible places, a silent declaration that this house has prepared itself. Garlic is rubbed into door frames, thresholds, and even onto skin. No one is certain it truly keeps Strigoi away, but not doing it feels too dangerous to attempt. Beside the cross stands garlic. It is hung placed, held traced over and over again, not from lack of faith, but because faith must be repeated to avoid unraveling. Each sign of the cross is a breath, a way to remind oneself that order still exists, that something still stands between human beings and the dark. These rituals are not discussed much. They require no explanation. Everyone performs them because everyone else does. In a community held together by silent agreement, that is enough. There are nights when preparation becomes more tense than usual. St. Andrew's Eve is one of them. It is believed to be the night of wolves, the night when the boundary between worlds is thinnest, the night when Strigoi is strongest, not because it changes, but because people grow weaker. On that night, the entire village draws inward. Doors are closed earlier, lamps are extinguished sooner. No one steps outside unless it is necessary. More garlic is added. Crosses are checked again. Household objects are turned upside down because wandering souls are believed to hide inside them. Millet seeds are scattered at doorways, not to trap, but to delay. Ancient belief holds that Strigoi must stop to count every grain. Whether or not this is true matters less than what the act provides. It creates the feeling that time can be bought, that dawn might arrive before the worst occurs. Inside those houses, people speak little. They do not tell ghost stories to frighten one another. They do not laugh to reassure themselves. They exist in a very specific state, alert yet exhausted, believing yet doubting, and above all, needing ritual while being afraid to question its meaning. Because once the questions begin, everything falls apart. Ritual here is not an expression of unshakable belief. It is the shape of controlled fear. People do not perform rituals because they are certain they work. They do so because without them, sleep becomes impossible. And without sleep, the soul weakens. And once the soul weakens, everything they fear becomes possible. This is a closed loop feeding itself. The village closes its doors to the darkness, not because it believes the darkness will disappear, but because it needs a boundary, a line however fragile between inside and outside. When the world grows too vast and incomprehensible, shrinking it down to four walls is the only way people feel they still control something. You might find yourself wondering, even if you never say it aloud, why they cling so tightly to rituals they are not certain work. The answer lies like fear itself. Fear does not need truth. It needs action, any action, as long as it can be repeated, taught to children, and made into proof that people are not entirely helpless. On nights like St. Andrew's Eve, ritual is no longer a personal choice. It becomes a social obligation. If one house does not hang garlic, if one door is not marked with the sign of the cross, that absence is no longer just a personal risk. It is seen as a danger to the entire village. In the world of Strigoi, disaster does not respect household boundaries. And so rituals spread not by command, but by glances, by the silence that follows when someone fails to comply, by the fear being the weakest link. Eventually, no one remembers where the rituals began. They simply exist like reflexes, like raising a hand to shield one's face from a cold wind. No reason required, only the sense that it feels slightly safer. Ritual does not drive Strigoi from the world, but it drives away something else, just as dangerous psychological collapse, the moment when people must confront the idea that they are completely powerless against what happens at night. And so the rituals continue night after night, year after year, until they become part of life itself, needing no explanation, no justification. When fear needs a form, people will create one, not to defeat the darkness, but to continue living beside it. But ritual is only the first line of defense. When it no longer soothes, when sickness continues to spread, when the signs do not fade, people are forced to go further. And when that happens, fear no longer stops at the threshold of the home. It turns toward the place where the dead lie and asks a question no ritual can answer for them. After the nights of ritual, when doors have been shut and garlic has been hung, fear does not retreat. It only changes direction. From the living, it turns towards the dead. Because in this world, not all deaths are the same. Some deaths are spoken of as good, and there are deaths no one wants to name. Bad deaths. A bad death does not need a monster. It carries its own curse. A bad death comes too early, too suddenly, or burdened with too much resentment. It is the person who takes their own life in silence, the one who is killed before final words can be spoken, the one who dies carrying bitterness that was never released. In folk belief, such deaths do not close properly. They leave a gap, and through that gap, the soul cannot find its way. Those who die by suicide are feared most of all, not because they are weak, but because they have rejected sacred order. To close the door of one's own life by hand means no one else can open the path beyond it. Their soul, in this way of thinking, is welcomed nowhere. It belongs neither to the living nor to the world beyond. Those who die unjustly are no different. Their deaths are unprepared, without ritual, without timely prayer. The soul is torn from the body before it is ready, and in that shock, it does not know where to go. Those who die, carrying hatred with anger, still burning, bring something more dangerous than all the rest will. A soul with a strong will can cling to this world through memory, through grievance, through the desire to reclaim what was lost. No one says they become Strigoi immediately, but everyone understands they do not leave easily. After death occurs, time begins to slow. There are 40 days during which the soul, according to belief, still lingers. It visits familiar places, houses once lived in, roads once walked, faces once loved or hated. For a peaceful soul, this is farewell. For an unquiet soul, it is disorientation. During those 40 days, The living exist in a state of tense waiting, not waiting for mourning to end, but waiting to see whether the soul will leave at all. Dreams are watched, sudden chills, sounds without clear sources. Every sign is read as a message from the other side. The time before burial is the most strained of all. The body lies still, but not yet sealed by earth. It remains in the house or in an open coffin, watched constantly, not out of reverence but caution. People fear that if their eyes leave it, something may change. Mirrors are covered, clocks are stopped, not for solemnity, but out of fear that the soul might see itself and become trapped. These details are not meant to honor the dead. They are meant to protect the living. When the coffin is carried to the cemetery, the air does not grow lighter. This is not a release. It is a confrontation. A confrontation with a question no one dares ask directly. Will this burial be enough to keep everything beneath the ground? The earth opens. The coffin is lowered. The first clods of soil fall onto the wooden lid, dry and heavy. Each sound lands like a heartbeat, a silent plea that this will be the final time the dead touch the world above. But the moment is not rushed. The grave is not filled quickly. Everything is slowed, as if stretching this instant might help the soul find the right path, as if enough care, enough patience could prevent what everyone fears. Certain measures are taken even during burial. A coin placed in the mouth, so the soul will not bite the shroud. The body is buried face down, so that if it tries to dig upward, it will only dig deeper. These acts are not performed in panic. They are carried out with a disturbing calm, as if long familiar. You might wonder, standing there, whether you would do the same. Not because you are certain it works, but because you would not dare refuse to believe. When the grave is finally sealed, the tension does not end. It shifts. The 40 days that follow become a period of observation. The dead person's family is watched more closely. Illness, nightmares, and small accidents that follow one another are no longer coincidental. If after 40 days everything remains calm, people exhale. The soul has gone, but if sickness continues, if livestock still die, if a familiar figure is seen at the edge of the village at dusk, fear returns heavier than before. At that point, death is no longer an ending. It becomes the beginning of suspicion. Suspicion that the ritual failed, that the soul did not leave as hoped. That which lies beneath the grave is no longer only memory. From here, Strigoi is no longer a vague possibility. It gains timing conditions and its own internal logic. A bad death, an unquiet soul, a waiting period filled with signs. And once people believe some deaths must be monitored after burial, the cemetery is no longer a place of rest. It becomes a temporary space, something that must be watched, a place where if anything seems wrong, the community must intervene, not out of cruelty, but because they believe that doing nothing will allow the consequences to spread to everyone. Here, fear is not aimed at death itself. It is aimed at unfinished deaths, deaths that leave questions behind. And in the world of Strigoi, questions are the most dangerous thing of all, because if death is not enough to end something, then there will come a moment when people believe they must do more, something beyond defense, something done directly to the one already lying beneath the earth. And once that thought takes hold, the path toward digging up the grave is no longer far away. After 40 days of waiting, when fear does not dissolve but settles like silt, at the bottom of water, the village begins to breathe differently. No one says it aloud, yet everyone senses that something has slipped out of place. The rituals have been performed. The prayers have been spoken. The grave has been sealed. And still the signs remain persistent and unsettling, like a fever that refuses to break. The grave becomes the center of attention, even though no one dares look at it directly. At first, there are only small details, easy to dismiss if one wishes to. A slight collapse of soil after a rain, a small hole, as if something beneath were breathing, faint footprints in the morning mist leading from the cemetery toward the village before disappearing. No one claims these are proof, but no one forgets them either. Rumor does not explode, it spreads. Like a disease, it requires no announcement, only repetition. One person whispers to another, a sentence left unfinished, a lingering glance toward the cemetery at dusk. Gradually scattered fragments assemble into an image no one consciously creates, yet everyone recognizes. No one wants to be the first to speak it aloud. To speak is to accept responsibility, the responsibility of naming a fear that once named cannot be taken back. And so the village remains silent. This silence is not peace, it is dense. People avoid holding one another's gaze for too long. They avoid walking past the cemetery alone. They avoid speaking the name of the dead, as if naming might draw them closer. Then other signs appear. Livestock fall ill one after another. A child develops a fever with no clear cause. Someone in the dead person's family begins to waste away, eyes hollow, sleep restless. Dreams repeat themselves, dreams in which the deceased stands at the edge of the bed, saying nothing, only watching. You might wonder whether at this point they could still stop, whether they could decide. It is all a coincidence, return to prayer, and wait longer. But collective psychology does not move like individual reason. When many people fear the same thing, that fear gains weight. It pulls each person's thoughts in the same direction. Each new sign is not judged on its own. It is placed atop the pile of signs already gathered, making the whole heavier. The grave is no longer just one grave among many. It becomes the suspected grave. Conversations begin to happen at twilight, when the day's work is finished, but night has not fully arrived. These conversations have no clear subject. People speak of weather, of crops, then drift towards strange signs. No conclusions are drawn. Yet with every silence that follows, a remark, certainty grows by another fraction. This creates a disturbing paradox. No one wants to believe that someone from their village has become a Strigoi, but no one wants to be the only one who does not believe if it turns out to be true. Personal safety begins to depend on shared agreement, and so suspicion turns into conviction, not through new evidence, but through the absence of objection. People begin to watch the grave more closely, not openly, not by day, but in moments when no one is supposed to notice. A hidden lantern beam, a detour past the cemetery without a clear reason. Each person checks on their own, and when they return, they say nothing. But their eyes have changed. Stories of Strigoi from other villages resurface not as distant tales, but as precedents. People remember what they once heard about graves opened about signs that matched too closely to ignore. Collective memory begins its work, pulling old images forward to fill the gaps of the present. At this stage, the question is no longer whether it is true. It becomes what must be done if it is. This is the most critical shift. Once a community moves from doubt to preparation for action, everything else becomes secondary. Morality, law, even respect for the dead. All are placed beneath a new priority: collective survival. No one stands up and proposes opening the grave. Yet everyone knows it is approaching as a storm felt in the air long before clouds appear. Hesitation lingers a while longer, not because they believe the suspicion is wrong, but because they fear the consequences of confirming it. To open a grave is not merely an act against the dead. It is a declaration that ritual has failed, that prayer was not enough, that the community must correct a metaphysical error with its own hands. That weight is heavier than any fear that came before. And then, as it so often happens, something tips the balance. A new death, an illness that does not pass, a sign too clear to ignore. At that point, silence breaks, not with shouting, but with a cold consensus. A private meeting takes place. No records, no votes. Only slow nods, eyes avoiding one another, and a decision that does not need to be spoken. The grave will be opened. No one feels relief when the decision takes shape. Fear thickens, but it now has direction. And for humans, directed fear is always more bearable than fear without form. From that moment on, the grave is no longer a resting place. It becomes a focal point, a physical question that demands an answer through action. Beneath the soil lies either a body decaying as nature intends, or something else entirely, something that has given rise to all the signs. Night is chosen not for secrecy, but because it fits the logic of fear. If Strigoi exists, it is strongest at night, and if they must face it, they will do so at the time they believe is right. When the shovel is about to touch the earth, the escalation is complete. From vague suspicion to rumor to collective certainty, that path needs no leader. It forms itself step by step until there is no way back. And now the question is no longer whether they are wrong. It is what they will do with whatever they find beneath the ground once the grave is opened. No one sleeps that night, not because of noise, but because of waiting. A dense kind of waiting that presses down on the chest, making each breath shallow and short. When darkness fully settles, the village seems to retreat into itself. Lamps are extinguished early. Doors are bolted shut. Only a small group quietly separates from the rest, carrying shovels, ropes, and a silence that has long been agreed upon. No one says this is right. There is only the fact that no one can endure doing nothing any longer. The cemetery at night is not the same place it is by day. Familiar graves feel foreign, as if the ground itself has shifted in the dark. Dew-soaked grass brushes cold against trouser legs. Every step is placed carefully, not for fear of slipping, but for fear of waking something that might be listening. The suspected grave lies there, no different from the others. It does not glow. It does not tremble. There is no obvious supernatural sign, and it is precisely this ordinariness that makes everything unbearable. If something is wrong, it is in no hurry to reveal itself. The moment the shovel touches the earth arrives more slowly than expected. Metal meeting soft soil produces a dull, muted sound, ordinary and unremarkable. And that is what makes it terrifying. It turns the unthinkable into a real action happening right now. No one digs quickly. Each thrust of the shovel feels like a repeated question. Should we continue? Yet no one stops. To stop now would render everything meaningless. As the soil is lifted away, a familiar damp smell rises, the scent of earth long undisturbed. There is no stench of decay, only a cold, heavy odor, like a room sealed shut for too long. Time stretches, no one knows for how long. In darkness, time does not move normally. It contracts around each motion, each breath, each scrape of metal against stone, until the sound changes. A different impact, harder, deeper. The coffin. No one says it aloud, but everyone stops at the same instant, not because fear erupts, but because of something else. A cold confirmation that there is no turning back. From here on, everything will either be explained or it will become far worse. The coffin is hauled up slowly. The ropes strain and creak. Old wood groans softly, not breaking, but complaining. No one looks directly at the lid when it is set on the ground. Flickering torchlight reveals old scratches, rusted nails. Everything is in place. And that is what makes hearts pound harder. Before the lid is opened, there is a pause. A brief pause, but long enough for each person to imagine what they are about to see. Not a monster, not movement, but the possibility that every doubt has been correct. The lid is opened. There are no screams, no cries of horror. Only a heavy silence falls, as if the air itself has been pulled away. Inside, the body lies still, not twisted, not deformed, not treated by time the way one expects. The skin is not gray, not dry. It is darkened but full. The face has not collapsed inward, but holds an expression difficult to name, not peaceful, not in pain. The lips are slightly parted, as if having just released a final breath, or preparing to draw one in. No one needs to say that something is wrong. In a world without embalming or chemistry, death should leave clearer marks than this. Yet here time seems to have hesitated, or been restrained. Fingernails appear longer, hair darker. These details taken alone might be dismissed, but together they form a very specific sensation, the sense that what lies before them has not gone away. Someone leans closer, not out of curiosity, but necessity. In the torchlight, there is something dark at the corner of the mouth. Not flowing, not fresh, but unmistakably something that should not be there. Dried blood or something like it. No one touches the body. No one needs to. Every story once whispered suddenly gains weight. The dreams, the illnesses, the footprints in the mist. Nothing feels coincidental anymore. The pieces align with terrifying precision, as if this moment has been waiting all along. Someone turns away, not from disgust, but from the realization that they will never see this person the same way again, no matter the love once held, no matter that they buried them with their own hands. This is no longer a relative, no longer a neighbor. In that moment, the body becomes evidence, and evidence does not require emotion. No one speaks the word Strigoi aloud. There is no need. It hangs among them, heavy as cold fog. The most frightening thing is not what they see, but how quickly agreement settles. No argument, no objection. No one suggests there might be another explanation. Because when faced with a body that refuses to decay, reason becomes fragile. And fear, long cultivated across every corner of life, rushes in to fill the void. You might ask yourself, if it were you standing there, what would you do? Would you demand they stop? Or would you remain silent like the others? Because silence is safer than resisting a certainty that has just taken shape. In that moment, exhuming the grave is no longer the worst act. The worst act is what comes next, once the community believes it has found the source of all its suffering. An undecayed corpse does not create a monster by itself, but it allows people to believe that monsters are real. And when that belief is confirmed by sight, by smell, by the chill crawling up the spine, every remaining barrier grows thin. The coffin is left open in silence. No one rushes, as if they need time to accept what they have seen. But deep inside, the decision has already been made. Not by one person, by all of them at once. Exhumation is the moment no one wishes to remember, not because it is grotesque, but because it is the moment humans cross a boundary that once crossed makes it impossible to return as they were before. From here on, they are no longer merely defending themselves. They believe they must act. And when a community comes to believe that killing once is not enough, death will no longer be the last thing they bring into that night. No one calls it murder. No one uses heavy words. In the moment the body lies exposed under torchlight, what they believe is happening is not violence, but correction, a necessary intervention to complete what was left unfinished. A ritual meant to restore order where it has slipped out of place. Killing a second time, as they understand it, is not aimed at the person who once lived. It is aimed at those who refuse to leave. The stake has been prepared in advance. Not just any piece of wood, it must come from a tree believed to carry the power to harm what does not belong in this world. The stake is smoothed, not sharpened to slice, but hardened enough to pierce. Everything is done slowly, carefully, like a surgical procedure carried out in darkness. No one screams when the stake is placed against the chest. No one cries. There is only a quiet tension, as if the entire village is holding its breath at once. The moment the stake is driven through brings no grotesque sound, just pressure, a dull impact, and the sensation that something has been pinned firmly to the earth. Some swear they hear a breath escape. Others say it is only the wind. No one argues. The argument is unnecessary now. What matters is not what truly happened, but that they believe the ritual has touched the heart of the problem. After the stake comes the shovel. No sword, no ceremonial blade, only something familiar, something tied to daily labor. The shovel blade is heavy, crude, but decisive. When the head is severed from the body, there is no release, no sense of victory, only a deeper silence, as if the space itself has been sealed shut. The head is not left where it falls. It is placed between the feet or buried separately, not as punishment, but as prevention, to ensure that what has been divided cannot find its way back together. Then comes the part no one wants to witness, yet everyone accepts. The heart. It is removed carefully, as though it is the last place where something dangerous might still linger. They believe memory remains there. Resentment. Will that refuse to dissolve? The heart is not dealt with on the spot. It is taken away often to a crossroads, a place that belongs to no one. A fire is lit, not large, not dramatic, just enough to burn until no shape remains. As the heart turns to ash, no one stares for long, not out of fear, but because the moment carries an unbearable weight, as if they are watching the complete erasure of something that was once human. The ash is collected with great care, not hurried, not allowed to scatter, because within the logic of the ritual, what was most dangerous has been destroyed, but what remains may still hold healing power. When the ash is brought back, it is not treated as a trophy. It is medicine, mixed with clean water, given to those who have grown weak, those believed to have been drained of life. No one asks whether it truly works. Drinking the ash is not an act of absolute faith. It is an act of last hope. After the ritual, there is no celebration, no laughter, no burst of relief. Only exhaustion spreads through the village, as if everyone has endured a long illness. People disperse in silence. Each returns home. No one looks back at the cemetery. No one speaks further. The days that follow are days of waiting. People observe closely, but quietly. Are the animals stronger? Do the children sleep better? Do the dreams feel lighter? No one wants to admit they are searching for proof of what they have done. If things improve, the ritual is considered successful. No confirmation is needed, no retelling. The story is closed through silence because speaking too much would allow memory to resurface. If things do not improve, no one wants to imagine that possibility. Because when killing a second time is not enough, the next question is too terrifying to face. What matters most is the change in atmosphere. After the ritual, the village does not become happier. It becomes quieter. A tense quiet where people avoid looking directly at what has occurred, as if by refusing to name it, they can keep the memory from rising. You might wonder whether the ritual truly frees anyone, the living or the dead. For the one beneath the earth, everything has ended, whether by natural means or by force. They are no longer the center of fear, but for the living, the ritual leaves a deeper mark. They have crossed a moral boundary no one wishes to acknowledge. They have witnessed and taken part in the destruction of a body that was once loved. There is no way back from that. And so silence becomes the greatest consequence of the ritual. No one recounts the details. No one wants their children to hear the full story. A blurred version remains enough to explain that the village once faced darkness and survived. Killing a second time does not bring triumph. It brings the feeling that order has been stitched back together with coarse thread. Ugly, uncelebrated, but necessary as they understand it. And because there is no celebration, no glory, the ritual does not become a heroic legend. It becomes a suppressed memory, something no one wants to remember, but no one can forget. From this point on, Strigoi is no longer an invisible fear. It has been touched, cut apart, and burned. But the price is the knowledge that when a community believes it has the right to correct death itself, the line between protection and destruction becomes terrifyingly thin. And as silence settles over the village after the ritual, what remains is not absolute peace, but a question hanging in the air, unanswered. If one day the signs return, would they be willing to do this again? After the ritual, the village sinks into silence. Not a panicked silence, but one exhausted from carrying too many unspoken things. Yet far from that place, in brightly lit rooms where desks are wiped clean and ink is always ready, something else is happening. Not fear, not ritual, but record-keeping. The 18th century arrives with a new belief that everything, if observed closely enough, can be understood. The Habsburg Empire expands eastward, and along with soldiers and laws it brings officials, people trained to measure, to count, to file reports, people who believe the world can be ordered through administrative language. When they arrive in villages where Strigoi have been unearthed and killed a second time, they do not carry garlic or crosses. They carry pins. The reports begin with ordinary lines: date, location, village name, name of the deceased. The tone is dry, precise, and emotionless. There is no space for hesitation, no room for fear, only what was seen and what was done. A body exhumed after several weeks of burial. No signs of decomposition. Skin remains elastic, fingernails longer, hair thicker. Liquid blood is present in the oral cavity. There are no exclamation marks at the end of these sentences. For the officials, this is not evidence of demonic forces. It is a phenomenon to be described, and it is precisely the way they describe it that chills the spine, because they are not trying to convince anyone. They are merely recording with the calm detachment of people who have never had to sleep in a house haunted by memory. In one report, an official notes that when a stake was driven into the corpse's chest, a considerable amount of fresh blood flowed out. There is no speculation, no attempt at explanation, just an observation deemed unusual, but not enough to disrupt the structure of the sentence. Science at this stage is not yet capable of disproving folk belief, but it is also not ready to accept it. Instead, it stands in between, coldly documenting everything as if compiling a case file for a new disease. Perhaps what makes these reports so unsettling is not their content, but their voice. None of the writers expresses fear. None describes how they felt. None raises moral questions. As if they are standing outside the event, looking into a different world where people dig up graves and kill the dead as a reflex of survival. You may wonder, reading these lines, who you would trust more: the villagers trembling in the night, or the official writing under lamplight. Because when fear is rendered in neutral language, it becomes far harder to dismiss. These reports are sent back to Vienna, copied, read in salons, where people who have never set foot in a cemetery at night discuss them as curiosities. Philosophers debate, physicians question, but the lines remain unchanged. Bodies that do not decompose, rituals performed, outcomes noted. Reason, when it encounters darkness, does not react by screaming. It reacts by falling silent and writing things down. And it is precisely this silence that gives darkness a clearer shape. There is no conclusion in the reports, no declaration that Strigoi exist or do not exist. Only a sequence of events placed side by side, allowing the reader to draw whatever belief they choose. Science here does not free humanity from fear. It merely gives fear a new form, one that is harder to deny. Notably, officials often record that after the ritual is completed, the village returns to normal. Illness subsides. Livestock recovers. Order is restored. They do not comment on the connection, but the fact that it is written down is enough. Those lines unintentionally accomplish something no one set out to do. They legitimize fear, not through faith, but through paperwork, not through oral tradition, but through the seal of empire. Strigoi, once a local terror, becomes a matter discussed on a continental scale, no longer just folklore. It becomes a phenomenon that is reported, analyzed, and archived. And when fear is archived, it does not fade easily. There is a cold paradox here. Villagers believe they are fighting darkness through ritual. Officials believe they are fighting superstition through reason. Yet both are doing the same thing: recording, fixing, giving fear a shape solid enough that it cannot be ignored. When reason meets darkness, it does not always win. Sometimes it only sharpens the edges. And from these reports, something begins to take form. Not absolute truth, but a story capable of traveling farther than any small village. A story able to cross borders, languages, and time. Strigoi, under the cold pen of early science, steps out of forests and graveyards. It enters libraries, intellectual salons, and the imagination of all Europe. From here on, fear no longer belongs only to those who live in the dark. It begins to live in the light, and that more than anything will transform it into something else. Something more familiar and no less dangerous. Because when darkness is recorded by reason, it does not disappear. It only learns how to last longer. After the reports were written, after the ink dried on the paper, and fear was filed away in archives, A long pause followed, not the silence of a village after a ritual, but the silence of time itself. Time is long enough for different questions to begin emerging. No longer questions about demons, but questions about the human body. Science did not arrive like a blinding light to drive away the darkness. It arrived slowly, cautiously, and often only after everything had already happened. When physicians began to re-examine the phenomena once called strigoi, they did not begin by denying them. They began by rereading what had been recorded: bodies that did not decompose, families wasting away, deaths occurring one after another within the same household. Seen through a new lens, these fragments began to arrange themselves into a different order. Not the order of the metaphysical, but the order of disease. Tuberculosis, once called consumption, was among the most insidious illnesses of old Europe. It did not kill quickly. It drained life, gradually thinning. The body paling, the skin weakening the breath. The sick coughed, grew exhausted, and often died after long periods of decline. To a community with no understanding of bacteria or contagion, the disease looked exactly like a curse. More terrifying, still, tuberculosis did not come alone. It spread within families. One person died, then the spouse, then the child. One by one, in the very sequence, strigoi were believed to return and drain the life from their kin. No monster was required, no darkness, only shared air in closed spaces, and no way to understand what was happening. When science looked back, the image of strigoi began to change shape. No longer a corpse rising at night, but a disease seated at the dinner table, invisible, patient, and cruel. The signs seen on exhumed bodies also became less mysterious. In cold, low oxygen, damp soil, some corpses decompose more slowly than expected. Skin can swell as gases build up. Blood can seep from the mouth as internal tissues break down. Fingernails and hair do not truly grow, but as the skin retracts, they appear longer. Explained this way, everything sounds reasonable, but remember that villagers did not have these explanations when they stood around an open coffin. They had only what their eyes saw, their noses smelled, and the memory of loved ones slowly dying. Science, however accurate, arrived too late to console. More important than biology was psychology. When a community faced an epidemic without any concept of contagion, fear needed direction. It could not remain suspended forever. It had to attach itself to something specific. A cause, a face, a name. Strigoi provided that. Blame is not an inherently cruel act. It is a survival reflex. When people cannot fight an invisible enemy, they try to make it visible. A corpse can be exhumed, a body can be staked, a ritual can be completed. A disease cannot. When science decodes strigoi, it does not deny that what villagers felt was real. The fear was real. The suffering was real. The deaths were real. What changed was only the name of the cause. And even when science offers explanations, it cannot erase the Gothic emotion shaped over generations, because strigoi was never just an explanation for illness. It was a story that helped people face loss, that imposed order on chaos, that allowed them to believe suffering could be ended through action, no matter how horrific that action might be. You may wonder whether, had villagers known about bacteria and contagion, they would have dug up graves. Probably not. But that is a question of the present imposed on the past. In that moment, with what they knew and what they did not, their choices were not madness. They were logical within the framework of fear. Science looks back at strigoi and sees a mirror reflecting human fragility in the face of invisible forces. In the past, that force was disease. Today, it may be something else. When knowledge fails to keep pace with fear, humans will always search for explanations that have shape. And this does not belong only to history. Even as science advances, the instinct to assign blame persists. In the face of catastrophe, people still look for someone to hold responsible, still seek a center onto which they can place their anxiety. The difference is that today, strigoi no longer lie in a grave. It goes by other names: Writing about Strigoi in the language of science does not make the story less dark. It makes it sadder, because it shows that brutal rituals were born not of cruelty, but of helplessness. The acts we now call barbaric were desperate attempts to save a community by any means available. Science may decode Strigoi, but it cannot erase them completely, because Strigoi does not live only in misunderstandings of biology. It lives in the way humans react when pushed into the darkest corner of fear. And perhaps that is why, even though we no longer exhume graves or drive stakes into bodies, the story of Strigoi has never truly died. It has only changed form quietly over time, reminding us that whenever humans face what they do not understand, the old darkness is always ready to return, waiting only for a new name to be spoken. When science finally named disease, when graves were no longer opened at night, when wooden stakes and fire remained only in history books, it would be easy to believe that Strigoi had been left behind. A dark relic of ignorance, an old fear with no place in the modern world. But Strigoi never needed corpses to exist. What changed was not fear itself, but its shape. The communities of the past were small, enclosed villages. Today's communities are broader, more complex, but the psychological mechanism remains the same. When faced with what cannot be controlled, humans still seek to give it a human face, still looking for a center to carry their anxiety, still need a name. Today, Strigoi do not rise from graves. It emerges from screens, from rumors that spread faster than disease, from collective fears fed by prolonged uncertainty. The life drainers are no longer called by their ancient name, but the idea remains familiar. Someone is believed to be the reason society weakens. Someone is thought to carry something dangerous, even though no one has seen it with their own eyes. Darkness is no longer required. Repetition is enough. In the past, people looked at a family dying one by one and believed a dead relative was returning. Today, people look at a group, an individual, or an idea and believe it is the source of all instability. The mechanism of blame has not disappeared. It has only become more refined, less bloody, but no less cruel. The Strigoi of the modern world is not staked. It is excluded, named, isolated, labeled. And just like before, no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. But when enough people believe certainty forms without evidence, you may recognize this more than you expect. New fears follow the same old structure, an invisible threat, a sense that something is wrong, a series of coincidences arranged into a narrative, and finally a concrete target onto which all anxiety can be directed. Once the story feels convincing enough, action follows, justified as necessary. In the modern world, no one stands around an open coffin, but people still gather around unverified stories, still watch every small sign, still wait for the final moment that confirms their fear was right. What made the Strigoi of the past so haunting was not its form, but the way it was created by an entire community. And that truth has not lost its relevance. An individual rarely becomes a monster alone. Monsters are born when fear is shared, reinforced, and legitimized. Science can explain disease. Law can establish boundaries. But no system is entirely immune to collective fear. When tension persists, when loss accumulates, people still turn to simple stories to make sense of a complex world. And those stories always require a villain. Strigoi was never a single creature. It was a pattern, a way of thinking, an ancient reflex triggered whenever order begins to crack. When you believe someone is draining a community in whatever form that takes, Strigoi has entered the story even if no one calls it by that name. The most frightening thing is not that people once believed in Strigoi. It is that the logic behind that belief remains so easily activated. All it takes is enough fear, enough exhaustion, enough disorientation. The old villages are gone. Nighttime cemeteries are no longer the center of fear, but the space Strigoi once occupied is still there, and every era finds a way to fill it with shapes that suit itself. This story does not end with a final judgment, not because there is no conclusion, but because the conclusion always shifts with the listener, with the moment, with whatever they are most afraid of right now. Perhaps Strigoi was only a legend. Perhaps it was a mistaken explanation for disease and death. Perhaps science buried it long ago. But perhaps what matters most is not the creature in the story, but the way the story keeps repeating itself in new forms, in new contexts, built on the same structure of fear. Perhaps Strigoi never truly left. Perhaps we only learned to call it by a different name.